Daniel Reeve had always lived a life of muted ambition, the kind that simmered just beneath the surface of everyday struggle. Born and raised in Eugene, Oregon, he grew up in a modest two-bedroom home on Alder Street with a younger sister, Megan, and a father who considered emotions a luxury no man should afford. His mother, Mary Ann, a former artist-turned-librarian, died when Daniel was 14, leaving him clinging to the sketchpad she once filled with surreal landscapes and soft-spoken wisdom. Daniel's fascination with buildings began not with architecture textbooks, but by watching how the morning sun pooled in the corners of their cracked kitchen tiles. He studied architecture at Portland State, barely affording rent, bouncing between part-time jobs, landscaping, delivery runs, even tutoring design freshmen just to keep himself afloat. His dream was never about grandeur or glass towers. He wanted to design cities people could feel, structures that whispered safety, warmth, and belonging. Yet, with every passing year, rejection emails from firms piled up like leaves in autumn, and his dream quietly ached behind a patient smile. Cassandra Monroe, on the other hand, carried the kind of grace that made silence feel meaningful. Born in Seattle to a high-profile attorney father and a theater costume designer mother, Cassandra grew up in a house full of contrasts. Her father, Gregory Monroe, believed in discipline and results. Her mother, Maribel, believed in soul and freedom. When her parents divorced at age 9, she chose to live with her mother and her supportive stepsister Amelia, who was 4 years older but treated her like a twin soul. Cassandra's childhood was one of ballet classes, classical piano lessons, and endless museum visits. By the time she was 17, she could identify Flemish Baroque from across the room, and she wrote a 40-page thesis on the ethics of art restoration before she ever entered college. After graduating top of her class in art history at NYU, Cassandra returned to the Pacific Northwest to work with independent galleries, eventually joining the Portland Modern Art Institute as their youngest assistant curator. But beneath her polished exterior was a gnawing insecurity, one born from living under the impossible standards of her father's new family and a heartbreak in college that left her distrustful of love. She often found herself restoring paintings at midnight, alone in the exhibit hall, wondering if anyone would ever understand the way she saw the world. Their paths could not have been more different, and yet, fate has a way of scripting symphonies from discordant notes. Daniel was putting together a conceptual installation on eco-conscious architecture for a regional design expo, while Cassandra had been asked to curate a companion exhibit focused on urban sustainability and historical art. Neither of them knew the other existed until a shared intern mixed up their visual layout files, forcing a last-minute joint meeting at the downtown venue's basement conference room. Daniel arrived late, soaked from rain, apologizing with breathless sincerity and tracing mud into the carpet. Cassandra, already irritated from a botched courier delivery and a tense phone call with her stepmother, was in no mood for pleasantries. But then he unrolled his sketches, hand-drawn renderings of a future Portland skyline filled with vine-covered rooftops and wind-powered homes. She leaned in, not just toward the paper, but toward the mind behind it. He, in turn, watched her as she explained her vision for reclaiming the past to inspire the future. In a world that constantly asked both of them to shrink, that accidental meeting felt like an expansion neither anticipated. What started as mutual admiration over a misplaced file would become the quiet ignition of something neither of them dared to name yet, but already, the roots were forming beneath the surface. The day they officially met, really met, not over mixed-up documents or a fumbled handshake, was the day that marked Portland's annual Green Urban Future Art and Sustainability Symposium. The Portland Modern Art Institute was buzzing with curated pieces that fused technology with tradition, and in one glass-walled gallery corner, Cassandra's team had assembled an evocative display of Renaissance-era paintings digitally enhanced to reflect environmental decay. Across the room, Daniel stood in front of a minimalist, moss-lined wooden installation he had designed, titled The Breathing City. With its open lungs carved into its core and wind tunnels that whistled when gallery doors opened, it caught the attention of visitors and critics alike. Cassandra spotted it while touring the space before the guests arrived, not knowing its creator stood just a few steps away, nervously adjusting a warped wooden edge with sandpaper and a worried frown. She approached the structure, and for a second, they simply stood side by side, her evaluating it through the lens of symbolic curation, him watching her lips part slightly in a quiet gasp of approval. "It breathes," she finally said, not to him, but to the piece. He turned to her slowly, visibly stunned. "That's what I hoped someone would say." What followed wasn't flirtation in the traditional sense, it was a dance of intellectual curiosity, one idea colliding with another, a conversation that unfurled and folded again, like carefully restored parchment. Cassandra asked about his design process, and Daniel, eager but unsure, explained how each curve mimicked airflow patterns studied in wind tunnels. She countered with a comparison to a 17th-century German cathedral built for acoustics and air. They moved from exhibit to exhibit, occasionally stopping to discuss a detail most visitors would overlook, a brushstroke, an energy-efficient lighting fixture, an inscription carved into wood. When Amelia arrived at the gallery to hand Cassandra her event notes, she was surprised to find her usually reserved sister in what looked suspiciously like a genuine smile mid-discussion. From across the room, Riley watched silently, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. She didn't speak, but her presence shifted the air slightly. That night, Daniel returned to his apartment more awake than he had been in months, while Cassandra lay in her candle-lit bathtub staring at the ceiling, a flicker of something unexpected lingering in her chest. They had not exchanged phone numbers. They didn't need to. The symposium committee would naturally connect them later for post-event reviews. But something deeper had already connected, something intangible, echoing silently between them. In the weeks that followed, their professional communication blossomed into late-night texts about artists and architects, scheduled feedback sessions that somehow turned into coffee shop detours, and unplanned run-ins that didn't feel coincidental. Cassandra, who once kept a solid wall between her emotions and her routine, began finding excuses to visit the design wing of the museum, while Daniel found himself sketching curved staircases and bridges inspired by her silhouette as she moved through gallery halls. Their differences became talking points, their similarities startling discoveries. Cassandra, who once feared emotional vulnerability, began opening up about her past, her complicated relationship with her father's new wife, the anxiety of never feeling enough despite her accomplishments, the quiet weight of curating other people's legacies while still trying to carve out her own. Daniel shared pieces of his fractured childhood, his father's silent expectations, the weight of being the man of the house after his mother's death, and the feeling of being invisible despite always trying to build something meaningful. One evening, after attending a lecture on regenerative design, Daniel walked Cassandra to her car beneath a maple tree that bled crimson leaves in the glow of streetlights. Neither of them moved. "You make me feel like I belong somewhere," he said. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and gently took his hand, and in that moment, it was decided. They would no longer orbit each other. They would collide, with all the beauty, chaos, and consequence that would come with it. The first real test of their relationship began not with an argument, but with an opportunity. Cassandra had been offered a 3-month curatorial consultancy in Chicago for an avant-garde gallery launching a climate and culture exhibit, while Daniel had just secured a 6-month contract to design eco-friendly microhousing prototypes for a pilot project in Ashland, several hours south of Portland. The tension wasn't dramatic or loud, it was soft, persistent, like water dripping through wood. They reassured each other with casual "it's only temporary," but distance, once introduced, has a way of stretching even the most vibrant connections. The weeks began with virtual calls and spontaneous video chats, but slowly devolved into brief texts and voicemails that echoed in silence. Daniel, ever the optimist, tried to stay upbeat, using the space to focus on his models and sketches, but often found himself distracted, rereading old messages from Cassandra and leaving his phone on loud, just in case. Meanwhile, Cassandra tried to stay grounded in gallery launches, curator dinners, and artist interviews, but the spark that usually lit her passion began to dim. She found herself gazing out of the tall gallery windows in downtown Chicago, wondering why the sunrise didn't feel the same anymore, why even triumph felt lonely. Daniel's support system during those months became a pair of individuals who offered opposite kinds of comfort. His roommate Marcus, a freelance photographer with an untamable afro and a wicked sense of humor, constantly reminded Daniel that he had to protect his peace first. "Women will always come and go," Marcus said while editing images of wildfires in California. "But your vision, man? That's yours alone." Elena, a gentle, observant trauma nurse who lived in the next building, offered quieter, more careful support. She had known Daniel since their freshman year and had always quietly admired his ability to find hope even in failure. One evening, when Daniel returned from a discouraging project pitch rejection, Elena sat on his balcony with him, sipping ginger tea and listening as he vented about missed calls, Cassandra's growing distance, and the sinking fear that maybe he wasn't enough for her world. "Maybe she's just overwhelmed," Elena said, watching his eyes for truth he wasn't speaking. "Or maybe she's scared. People don't disappear because they don't care. Sometimes they just don't know how to stay." Her words stayed with him longer than they should have. And in the background, Marcus had started asking questions about Cassandra's ambitions, if Daniel ever felt like her world was just waiting to outgrow him. Daniel dismissed it outwardly, but the question echoed in his mind like a warning bell. Cassandra wasn't without her own shadows. In Chicago, she found herself surrounded by charismatic artists, wealthy patrons, and polished intellectuals who spoke in metaphors and made everything feel abstract, even love. She attended dinners where men twice her age clinked glasses and casually dropped names of art collectors and Nobel laureates. There was one particular artist, Julian Locke, a sculptor known for his brutalist environmental work, who grew increasingly interested in her ideas. He admired her elegance, her quiet intelligence, and often invited her for private previews and walks through his installations. Cassandra, aware of the subtle attention, always declined gently but began feeling the weight of Daniel's absence like a phantom limb. She missed his awkward pauses, his sketched notes slipped under her coffee mugs, the smell of cedar that lingered on his jackets. She missed being known without performance. But every time she tried to initiate a deep conversation with Daniel, the connection would falter, either bad reception, fatigue, or timing. And then there was the gallery director, Melissa Hart, who hinted with too much frequency that Daniel didn't quite match the life Cassandra was destined for. "Brilliance thrives with brilliance," she said one evening while reviewing Cassandra's exhibit plans. Cassandra didn't reply, but that night she didn't sleep. For the first time, a seed of doubt took root, not about her love for Daniel, but about whether that love had enough oxygen in the changing winds of their ambition. She began to wonder if love could survive not a storm, but slow erosion. Something was shifting. Neither of them could name it yet, but both had started feeling the distance not in miles, but in meaning. When Cassandra returned to Portland after her Chicago consultancy, the reunion with Daniel was neither dramatic nor heartwarming, it was awkward. The kind of awkwardness that grows not from lack of love, but from misaligned rhythms. She stepped off the train expecting the familiar warmth of his embrace, the cedar scent on his collar, and the boyish grin that always made her exhale without realizing she'd been holding her breath. But Daniel looked tired, his smile strained, and his hug brief. They rode in silence for most of the drive home, interrupted only by Daniel mentioning that Marcus had moved out and Elena had been checking in on him. Cassandra didn't ask further. At her apartment, the furniture seemed colder, the walls barer than she remembered. Their first dinner together was filled with surface-level updates, museum gossip, new sketches, grant applications. But underneath it all was a tension neither of them knew how to break. Cassandra had grown more assertive during her time away, Daniel had grown more withdrawn. What they both feared to admit was that time apart had shaped new versions of themselves, versions they weren't entirely sure how to fit together. Cassandra's return also reignited friction between her and her mother, Maribel, who had always supported her artistic ambitions but maintained quiet disapproval toward Daniel. Maribel believed Cassandra deserved a partner of social and financial stature, someone who could complement her brilliance, as she often phrased it during wine-soaked phone calls. Despite Maribel's criticisms, Cassandra remained defiant, but even she couldn't deny the increasing disparity between Daniel's unpredictable contract jobs and her own rapidly advancing career. It became more evident when they attended a gala honoring Cassandra's latest exhibit curation. Daniel showed up in a suit borrowed from Marcus, still slightly wrinkled, and stood beside her like a misplaced puzzle piece as she navigated conversations with gallery elites and art philanthropists. One guest, in particular, her former university professor, Dr. Colson, casually remarked to her, "He seems nice, but doesn't quite fit the canvas, does he?" Cassandra forced a smile but couldn't unhear the metaphor. Later that evening, Daniel overheard her defending him in the restroom hallway, her voice sharp and wounded. "He's the only one who sees me without my mask," she snapped. But even those words, sincere as they were, couldn't erase the new cracks forming between the life she lived and the man she loved. Meanwhile, Daniel's own struggles intensified. After months of working tirelessly on eco-design proposals, he finally received a rejection from the prestigious San Francisco Urban Redevelopment Fellowship, one he had placed all his hopes on. The email arrived on a rainy Tuesday, with a sterile subject line and a single sentence buried in professionalism: "We regret to inform you." He sat on the kitchen floor, back against the fridge, staring at his phone screen for nearly an hour before wiping his face and getting up like nothing had happened. He didn't tell Cassandra immediately. When she noticed he was unusually quiet over dinner, she assumed it was exhaustion. But the truth was heavier than fatigue. It was shame. Shame that he couldn't measure up to the image everyone expected of Cassandra's partner. He started pulling away in small ways, canceling plans, skipping events, forgetting inside jokes. Cassandra, caught between curating an upcoming traveling exhibit and managing her strained relationship with her mother, didn't push. They both drifted, not in bitterness, but in survival. And yet, on one particularly cold night, when Cassandra returned home after a failed board meeting and found Daniel asleep at his desk with a half-finished model cradled in his arm, she placed a blanket over his shoulders and kissed his forehead. He stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open, and whispered, "Don't give up on me." Her heart ached. And that whisper was everything unspoken. For a moment, the hurdles didn't matter. Only the harmony they still reached for in the dark. It was the job rejection Daniel didn't tell Cassandra about that finally broke something fragile inside him. In the weeks that followed, his creative energy dried up like a forgotten well. His sketches, once fluid and full of purpose, became stiff outlines that he couldn't finish. He'd sit in front of his drafting board for hours, erasing the same line over and over until the paper tore. The rejection from San Francisco wasn't just about losing a job. It felt like losing a piece of himself, a blow to his belief that his dreams could coexist with reality. Cassandra, though still occupied with planning her traveling exhibit and dealing with museum politics, began noticing the dimming light behind Daniel's eyes. He'd smile, but his eyes would retreat somewhere unreachable. He'd laugh, but the sound would dissolve halfway. When she tried to reach for him emotionally, he responded with short reassurances: "I'm fine, just tired." But what she didn't know, what Daniel didn't know how to articulate, was that his love for her had begun to feel like both a gift and a mirror. Her growth reminded him daily of how far he hadn't come. And he hated that envy had entered a space where love used to breathe freely. Cassandra, though often intuitive, missed the full weight of his internal collapse because she was weathering storms of her own. The museum's board had begun questioning her methods. They believed her exhibits leaned too emotionally forward, not neutral enough, not profit-friendly. A few whispers from envious colleagues, especially from Derek Langford, an older curator with a notorious history of undermining rising women, led to Cassandra's exhibit funding being threatened. Despite everything, she presented a bold proposal for her next show, titled Humanity in the Ashes, featuring contemporary art by war survivors and climate refugees. She delivered the presentation with poise and fire, and though it was eventually greenlit, the experience left her feeling bruised. It was in this wounded moment that Amelia and Riley decided to step in. They surprised her with a weekend retreat to the Columbia River Gorge, a rustic cabin, wine, hiking, and absolutely no museum talk. Cassandra hesitated but eventually agreed. Amelia, her older stepsister with a fierce protective streak, had always been her emotional compass. Riley, her childhood best friend turned sarcastic cheerleader, brought levity even to heartbreak. That weekend, amidst sunrises over the mountains and laughter around a fire pit, Cassandra finally broke down in tears and admitted her fear: "I don't know if Daniel and I are still growing in the same direction." Neither friend judged her. They simply listened, really listened. Sometimes, that's all the soul needs to remember how to breathe. Back in Portland, Daniel felt her absence more sharply than expected. The silence in their shared apartment grew louder each night. He tried to focus on a new freelance project designing modular eco-shelters for a nonprofit, but even that felt like pretending. One evening, he visited a bookstore they once spent hours in together, where she once danced between poetry shelves and hummed a sad tune so softly he could barely hear it. There, he ran into Elena, who noticed the bags under his eyes and the slouch in his shoulders. They sat outside with coffee, and she gently asked, "What are you afraid of losing more, her or yourself?" It wasn't judgment, it was an honest question. Daniel couldn't answer. That night, alone in the apartment, he opened an old notebook where he used to write dreams, things he never told anyone, not even Cassandra. On one page, years old, he had scribbled, "Design a space where the world stops hurting." He stared at the words for a long time. Then he picked up a pencil. For the first time in weeks, he began to sketch, not for a paycheck, not for a committee, but for himself. It wasn't a solution. It didn't erase the cracks. But in that fragile moment of creating again, Daniel rediscovered a glimmer of the confidence he thought he'd lost. And perhaps, somewhere between those lines and shadows, the man Cassandra fell in love with was still waiting to be found. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was a simple cream-colored envelope tucked into a stack of mail, bills, flyers, a magazine subscription Cassandra had forgotten to cancel. Daniel almost missed it. It had no return address, just his name written in neat, elegant cursive that stopped his breath. He knew that handwriting. He had memorized it during a chapter of his life he thought he'd long buried, Samantha Hale. As he held the envelope in trembling fingers, the hallway seemed to blur. He didn't open it right away. He slid it into his messenger bag and continued about his day, distracted, disconnected. That evening, when Cassandra returned from a museum board meeting, animated about an upcoming artist feature, Daniel listened but barely heard. The envelope sat in his bag like a ticking device, daring him to break the seal. Later that night, while Cassandra slept curled toward the window, her hand resting gently on his pillow, Daniel stepped out onto the balcony. Under the orange hue of a street lamp, he opened the letter. It was short. Samantha had written to say she was in Portland for a limited-time collaboration with a luxury art house brand. She mentioned that seeing his name attached to a sustainability event had stirred something she couldn't ignore. The letter didn't beg or accuse, it simply lingered in nostalgia. It would be good to talk, it ended. No phone number. No signature. Just an unfinished bridge across the past. Daniel sat frozen for a long time, staring at the letter as if it held more power than ink and paper should. Samantha wasn't just an ex. She was the woman he had once planned a life with, until everything unraveled in the most brutal and public way. They had been engaged in New York during his early architectural internship years. She was a rising fashion designer, magnetic, confident, intoxicatingly ambitious. They were fire to fire. Their love had burned fast and fierce, but eventually it consumed itself. Samantha's obsession with legacy, image, and perfection clashed violently with Daniel's ideals of simplicity and honesty. When he pulled out of a lucrative partnership with a developer who Samantha had connections with, due to ethical concerns, it created a rift she never forgave. The breakup was messy, involving leaked emails, canceled exhibitions, and a public fallout that left Daniel blacklisted in several design circles. He left New York to protect what little integrity he had left and returned to Oregon a ghost of himself. Cassandra never knew the full story. He had always said only, New York was a mess. And now Samantha had re-entered his world like a specter, uninvited, but not entirely unexpected. He folded the letter, slipped it beneath a stack of invoices in his drawer, and told himself he would ignore it. But the damage had already been done. The past had been stirred, and nothing would remain untouched. The next morning, Daniel tried to return to normalcy, brewing coffee and complimenting Cassandra on her emerald blouse as if the letter hadn't pierced a hole through his chest. Cassandra, oblivious, was bubbling with excitement. She had just received a preliminary invite to co-curate a traveling exhibit with the Smithsonian Institution, a career-defining opportunity. As she danced around the kitchen reading the email aloud, Daniel watched her, a knot forming in his stomach. He should have told her. He wanted to. But how do you introduce a ghost into a home that has never known haunting? Later that day, as Cassandra left for a press event, Daniel found himself walking aimlessly until he stood outside an upscale gallery downtown, Maison d'Avant, known for high-fashion concept pieces. It was there, through the tall glass windows, that he saw her. Samantha. She was taller than he remembered, more poised, her honey-bronze skin glowing under soft exhibit lighting. She wore a sharp wine-colored suit, her hair now cut into a fierce bob. She was speaking to two executives, laughing, effortlessly commanding the room. She turned slightly, eyes scanning the lobby, and paused. For the briefest second, their eyes met. She smiled. Not arrogantly. Not warmly. Just knowingly. Daniel stepped back, heart slamming against his ribs. He didn't go in. He couldn't. As he walked away, he didn't notice the gallery assistant who had clocked his face, nor the receptionist who texted Samantha moments later, "He was here." Daniel told himself it meant nothing. But he knew better. The universe never knocks twice without reason. And whatever door Samantha Hale had come to open, he wasn't sure Cassandra would be ready for it. The letter was still hidden, and the encounter with Samantha remained locked in Daniel's mind like a ticking clock he refused to hear. He told himself he was protecting Cassandra, that Samantha's presence in Portland was temporary, inconsequential. But what he hadn't accounted for was how the memory of Samantha, the unresolved, complicated mess she had left behind, would begin to twist like a vine around his confidence. That emotional unraveling made the call from Milan all the more jarring. The W0RD Fellowship, one of Europe's most prestigious sustainable design programs, had accepted Daniel's application. He had applied months ago, before the San Francisco rejection, before Cassandra's Smithsonian invite, before Samantha had resurfaced like a storm cloud on a clear day. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, 6 months in Italy, a sponsored studio, mentorship from architectural legends, and global exposure. But there was a catch: he had to leave in 6 weeks. When he told Cassandra, she stared at him in shock, her hand still wrapped around her tea mug. "Milan," she repeated, and he nodded, unsure whether to smile or apologize. Her voice was calm, but her eyes blinked too fast. "You weren't going to tell me you applied?" He opened his mouth, but couldn't explain why he hadn't. Maybe because deep down, he didn't believe he'd get in. Or maybe because part of him feared what it would do to them. Cassandra had her own news, though it came wrapped in dreams, not dilemmas. The Smithsonian's email wasn't just an invite, it was a proposal. They wanted her to curate a landmark traveling exhibit titled Echoes and Ashes, Artifacts of Resilience, touring D.C., New York, Chicago, and London over an 8-month span. She would work with global historians, archive rare war-era collections, and even co-author a feature catalog. It was validation she had spent years striving toward. Yet when she told Daniel, it felt less like celebration and more like detonation. They both sat in the living room, sunlight casting a golden haze over everything, while the weight of possibility loomed. Milan. London. Italy. DC 6 months. 8 months. Separate cities. Separate lives. Cassandra tried to keep her voice light. "We'll figure it out. Long distance worked before, right?" Daniel didn't respond. He knew what she was trying to do, protect the illusion of stability. But they both knew this wasn't the same as before. Before, their roots had been new, flexible, still intertwining. Now, they were established, with separate ambitions growing in separate directions. And neither of them wanted to ask the question that lingered in the silence: what happens if we choose our dreams and lose each other in the process? Over the next 2 weeks, they existed like polite ghosts, sharing space but living in their heads. They attended gallery events, architecture expos, even had dinner with Riley and Amelia, laughing at stories and pretending the future wasn't a rapidly approaching storm. Riley noticed it first, the tightness in Cassandra's smile, the way Daniel flinched when she mentioned curator schedules or Rome layovers. Amelia tried to talk to her sister, but Cassandra brushed it off. "We're just figuring things out," she'd said with a brittle grin. But at night, when she lay beside Daniel, she felt the emptiness between them growing into a canyon. One evening, Daniel brought up the possibility of postponing the fellowship. Maybe he could defer a year. Cassandra's immediate protest surprised even her. "Don't you dare give up Milan because of me," she said. "If you do that, you'll only resent me later." Her voice cracked, but her spine stayed straight. Daniel didn't argue. He kissed her forehead and turned off the light. That night, neither of them slept. They stared at opposite walls, hearts aching in sync but pointed in different directions. And so the countdown began, not to a breakup, not to a dramatic finale, but to a quiet divergence. Two people in love with each other and in conflict with time, opportunity, and the question of whether shared love is enough when dreams no longer intersect. Daniel didn't plan it. Not the location, not the timing, and certainly not the weather. It began with a sleepless night and a sudden decision to just drive. He woke Cassandra before dawn, asked her to come with him without explanation, and she, tired of the silence and separation, agreed without resistance. They drove in near total silence for 3 hours until the familiar scent of saltwater and the roar of distant waves signaled they'd arrived at Cannon Beach. It was where they first spent a weekend together a year into their relationship, where they'd sketched on driftwood and collected seashells while building a sandcastle meant to resemble the Guggenheim. That day had ended in a storm, too. Now, as gray clouds rolled in and scattered tourists fled to shelter, Daniel pulled over near Haystack Rock. Cassandra stepped out with her coat pulled tight, hair whipping in the wind. "What are we doing here?" she asked, half yelling over the wind, half choking back emotion. Daniel didn't answer at first. He just looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. Rain began to fall in cold, pelting sheets, and still he stood there, soaked, trembling, heart thundering against his ribs. "I can't lose you," he finally said, his voice raw. "I'd rather fail in Milan. I'd rather never build anything again than build a life without you in it." Cassandra's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she forgot about the Smithsonian, about DC, about the board meetings and museum schedules. The rain washed it all away. Daniel reached into his soaked jacket and pulled out a small wooden box, the kind he had carved himself, unfinished around the edges, imperfect, real. Inside was a thin, silver ring, wrapped with a blue thread they had picked up during their first trip to the coast. "This isn't perfect," he said. "But neither are we. I know we've got oceans of ambition between us. But I also know I've never felt more at home than when I'm looking at you." Cassandra stood frozen, lips parted, her eyes glossy with disbelief. For someone who curated ancient relics and restored forgotten beauty for a living, this moment felt timeless, something that couldn't be framed or archived. He dropped to one knee in the wet sand, the rain now falling harder, baptizing the beach, baptizing them both. "Cassandra Monroe," he said. "Will you marry me?" Her answer came not in words but in motion. She collapsed into him, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, her tears mixing with rain as she whispered, "Yes. Yes. 1,000 times, yes." The kiss that followed was desperate, soaked, messy, and true. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't an erasure of their struggles. But it was a vow, a real one, made not at an altar, but beneath thunderclouds, where love could be louder than the storm. By the time they returned to Portland that night, drenched and exhausted, something in the air had shifted. They held hands on the couch as they dried their hair with towels, occasionally looking at each other and laughing, giddy, overwhelmed, breathless. Daniel texted Marcus and Elena with a simple photo of the ring on Cassandra's finger, and Cassandra called Amelia and Riley, both of whom screamed so loudly she had to put them on speaker. For once, the questions about jobs and cities faded into the background. They were still there, yes, waiting. But now they had a new center, a foundation. The following week, Cassandra took Daniel to her favorite quiet corner of the museum's closed archives, where she had lit candles and arranged the path of sketches he had drawn of her over time. At the end of the trail, she whispered, "Let's figure it out together," and handed him a hand-bound book labeled Blueprints of Us. Inside were photos, mementos, and blank pages waiting to be filled. For the first time in months, they slept without dreams of falling. And though neither of them could predict the storm still to come, they had made a choice, to try. To stand in the rain, together. If love was the easy part, planning a wedding was war dressed in lace. The first week after the proposal felt like bliss, soft whispers over morning coffee, ring glances during elevator rides, spontaneous dancing in the kitchen. But the moment they began discussing the guest list and venue, cracks emerged like fault lines beneath delicate porcelain. Cassandra wanted an intimate ceremony, historic, elegant, surrounded by curated beauty. Daniel envisioned something more rustic, open air, minimal, set against a backdrop of natural harmony. Neither idea was wrong. But every conversation became a quiet debate, each preference layered with unspoken meaning. Beneath Cassandra's desire for controlled beauty was a need to prove to her mother, and perhaps to herself, that this wasn't a compromise. Beneath Daniel's simplicity was a desperate urge to stay grounded, to avoid the traps of performance he once fell into with Samantha. Then came the logistics. The museum offered to host a private ceremony in its rooftop garden, but Cassandra feared it would feel more like a gala than a wedding. Daniel suggested a vineyard near Ashland, but Cassandra argued it was too far for Amelia and Riley, who were both now deep in planning roles. And in the middle of it all, the looming deadlines of Milan and DC waited, silent, pressing. Tensions escalated when Daniel's father, Harold Reeve, made his presence felt. A retired civil engineer turned real estate investor, Harold was known for his sharp tongue and colder heart. When Daniel invited him and his sister Megan to dinner, Cassandra made every effort to create a warm, welcoming environment. But Harold, unimpressed by the vintage wine or the carefully plated salmon, spent most of the meal questioning their timeline, finances, and Daniel's impulsive career path. He eyed Cassandra's ring and remarked, "No diamond? That's unconventional." Daniel nearly choked on his wine. Cassandra's smile remained intact, but her hands tightened under the table. Megan tried to divert the conversation with stories about her high school science class, but Harold wouldn't be dissuaded. And what happens when Milan offers a full-time opportunity? Or when curating takes you to London? Are you too prepared to give anything up? The question lingered long after dessert. Later that night, Cassandra asked Daniel why he hadn't warned her about his father's temperament. Daniel replied, "Because I thought he'd behave differently this time." But deep down, he knew better. Harold had never approved of any choice Daniel made unless it aligned with profit, structure, and power. And now, Cassandra felt like another fragile blueprint Harold expected to crumble. Riley and Amelia, sensing the emotional strain, stepped in like generals on a battlefield. Riley, with her colorful spreadsheets, mood boards, and relentless optimism, declared herself chief celebration officer. Amelia took on logistics, vendors, permits, contracts, with the precision of a diplomat negotiating peace. For a while, their presence helped. The two women tag-teamed Cassandra's stress and redirected Daniel's overthinking. Yet, underneath their support was a slow undercurrent neither of them spoke about. Amelia had noticed Cassandra's recent restlessness, how her fingers tapped longer on wine glasses when Daniel talked about Milan. Riley had noticed Daniel staring into space when Cassandra explained the museum's London itinerary. Each friend tried, in their own way, to keep the dream intact. They planned brunches, dress fittings, and cake tastings. They curated love songs and designed programs with watercolor sketches of the Oregon coast, echoing Daniel's proposal. But with each plan laid, a question brewed just beneath the surface: were they planning a wedding to celebrate a future, or to salvage a present already slipping through their fingers? No one dared voice it yet. Not Cassandra, not Daniel. But somewhere between the aisle designs and the RSVP debates, love, once spontaneous and tender, was now a list of bullet points. A checklist with too many hands and too little honesty. And none of them, not even Riley or Amelia, saw what storm was quietly building just over the horizon. The auditorium buzzed with conversation and camera shutters, the crowd a blend of architectural enthusiasts, professors, students, and corporate sponsors. Daniel had been invited to give a keynote presentation at a local sustainability and urban redesign summit, the kind of event he would have once dreamt of attending, let alone headlining. Cassandra had helped him rehearse for days, adjusting his slides, fine-tuning his inflection, and even picking out his charcoal blazer that morning. "It's your moment," she said, smoothing his collar with quiet pride. But as he walked onto the stage, hands lightly shaking behind the podium, he spotted her. She sat in the third row, alone, a slight smirk playing on her lips. Samantha Hale. Hair sleek in a low bun, a silk blood-red blouse tucked into a high-waisted skirt, minimal makeup with just enough defiance. Their eyes met for only a second, but that second sliced clean through Daniel's focus. His breath hitched, his mind briefly blanked. He blinked rapidly, adjusted his mic, and began his talk as if nothing had happened. Cassandra, seated backstage with a clear line of sight to the audience, noticed the flicker in Daniel's expression. She followed his gaze, and the pit in her stomach tightened when she saw the woman. Something about the poise, the audacity of presence, it was too confident to be casual. Cassandra didn't recognize her, but she didn't need to. Her instincts flared. And they rarely lied. After the applause died and the post-speech reception began, Daniel made a beeline for the exhibit table, avoiding Cassandra's gaze as if she had somehow become radioactive. But Cassandra followed him anyway, pretending not to watch how his eyes kept darting toward the crowd. Finally, she leaned into him and whispered, "Do you know her?" Daniel tensed. It was too late to lie. "That's Samantha," he said quietly, like he was uttering a curse. Cassandra blinked. "Your ex?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The one from New York?" Daniel nodded. He looked sick. She felt worse. Samantha didn't approach. She merely floated around the edges of the room, occasionally smiling at people, her presence like the scent of smoke after fire, lingering, undeniable. Riley arrived late and sensed the tension immediately. "Who's the fashion assassin in heels?" she muttered. Cassandra didn't respond. Her mind was too loud. That night, back at their apartment, Cassandra barely spoke. She ate in silence, then washed the dishes without being asked. Daniel tried to explain that he had no idea Samantha would show up, that she had been invited by a mutual colleague, that he hadn't spoken to her since the letter. "But you read it," Cassandra said softly, drying her hands. "And you didn't tell me." That hurt more than the sight of Samantha. The secrecy. The quiet permission Daniel had given to the past to return without warning. In the following days, the air between them became too heavy to breathe. Samantha hadn't reached out again, at least not directly, but Cassandra had seen enough. She began noticing the subtleties, how Daniel flinched at unknown numbers on his phone, how distracted he seemed while designing his new concept model, how his fingers hovered too long over his email inbox. Cassandra tried to push through, focusing on wedding planning, museum calls, and press interviews, but her mind kept replaying that moment in the auditorium, the electricity in Daniel's body the second he saw Samantha, the pause in his breath. She wondered what he had felt. Panic? Nostalgia? Regret? Amelia, sensing her stepsister's internal chaos, took her out for wine one evening and asked point blank, "Is there something you're not saying?" Cassandra opened her mouth, then closed it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm afraid if I say it aloud, it becomes real." Amelia nodded slowly. "Then I'll say it for you, something's off." That night, as Cassandra lay in bed next to Daniel, his back to her, hers to him, she realized a terrifying truth. Samantha didn't have to say a word. She didn't have to approach. Her mere presence had done what no argument could, crack the illusion of perfect. And deep inside her, Cassandra feared this crack wasn't just cosmetic, it was structural. And once you see a fracture, you can't unsee it. You start wondering when it'll break. The tension had become impossible to mask. Every time Cassandra walked into a room, she felt like she was arriving at the end of a conversation she was never supposed to hear. Daniel had become more evasive, filling silence with distractions, mock-ups, late-night YouTube videos about sustainable architecture, vague promises of "I'll explain it later." Cassandra no longer asked. Instead, she buried herself in finalizing the gallery invites, approving flower arrangements, and pretending everything wasn't fraying at the seams. One Saturday afternoon, after leaving a fitting appointment early due to a headache she faked, Cassandra returned to her apartment unannounced. She paused in the hallway when she heard familiar voices drifting from the living room, Riley and Amelia. The door was slightly ajar. Neither woman knew she had arrived. She heard Riley's voice first, low and sharp. "I'm telling you, Amelia, this woman's presence isn't coincidental. Samantha doesn't just show up quietly. And Daniel? He didn't just forget to tell Cass he was engaged to her." Cassandra felt her stomach drop. She froze. The word engaged echoed in her ears like a gunshot muffled in velvet. Amelia responded, hesitant. "I only found out a few days ago. I asked him, point blank. He admitted it, but begged me not to say anything. Said it was over. Said it was a different life." Riley scoffed. "Different life, my ass. You saw the way Samantha looked at him. Like she already knew the ending to a story we're just watching." Cassandra felt lightheaded. She backed away quietly, closed the door behind her without a sound, and left. She didn't cry. Not yet. She walked the streets of Portland for what felt like hours, her engagement ring cold against her finger. By the time she returned home, Daniel was alone on the couch, looking up architectural renderings on his tablet. She stood in front of him, silent. He looked up and knew instantly. There was no use pretending anymore. "You were engaged to her," Cassandra said calmly. "And you never told me." Daniel's lips parted, then closed. He set the tablet down and rubbed his face. "It was years ago. I didn't think it mattered." Her voice cracked. "It matters. Not just that you were engaged. That you lied by omission. That you kept her memory, her name, her presence, a secret. Daniel looked at her, finally meeting her eyes. I was ashamed. Not of her, of who I was with her. I didn't want you to see me through that lens. Cassandra shook her head. You didn't give me a choice. The days that followed were raw and silent. Cassandra didn't call off the wedding, but something within her pulled back, like a tide retreating slowly, revealing wreckage once buried under water. She spent more time with Amelia and Riley, but didn't speak about the conversation she had overheard. Riley was furious. She called Daniel a coward and suggested Cassandra cancel the wedding entirely. Amelia, more restrained, urged patience. You love him, she said gently. But you need to trust him again. And that's a different mountain. Cassandra nodded, but her heart felt hollow. She went to the museum late into the night, working long hours alone, restoring ancient ceramics while contemplating the fragility of modern love. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to salvage what he could. He texted her from the next room. He left notes on the bathroom mirror. He sent photos of old memories, their first photo booth kiss, the drawing of their dream home, the rainy beach proposal. Cassandra looked at each one, but they felt like postcards from a place she no longer lived. One evening, she finally replied with a single message, we need to talk. And this time, I want the full story. Daniel agreed. The next night, over 2 glasses of untouched wine, he told her everything, the way he and Samantha met, how fast it burned, how it ended. He didn't defend himself. He simply bared it all. When he finished, Cassandra didn't speak for a long time. Then she said softly, I would have rather known your worst truth than lived inside your best lie. She walked away without saying another word, leaving Daniel alone in the apartment they once called home, wondering whether love could survive not betrayal, but revelation. The morning of the wedding broke like a painting, clear skies, soft light pouring over the manicured garden of the Cedar Row estate, and the scent of blooming peonies riding the breeze. Cassandra stood before the mirror in her dressing suite, her breath catching at the sight of her reflection. Her ivory gown was simple, elegant, sculpted to her like it had been made for moonlight. A delicate lace veil, stitched with vines like the ones Daniel once sketched in his notebook, framed her face. Amelia stood behind her, hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the hem. You look like the heroine of your own story, she whispered. Riley entered then, unapologetically emotional, dabbing her eyes while holding a flute of champagne. Despite the recent fractures, everything looked perfect. Guests were arriving, soft piano music played, and the venue staff moved like clockwork. Even Daniel, down the hill in his suite, had managed to smile. He wore a light charcoal suit, his boutonniere matched Cassandra's bouquet, and his best man, Marcus, kept whispering terrible jokes to keep his nerves at bay. There was a weight on his chest, yes, but he told himself the truth had been aired, the ghosts addressed. What remained was love. He believed that. Or at least, he hoped. Guests rose to their feet as Cassandra appeared at the top of the garden path, arm in arm with her stepfather, wearing serenity like a crown. Daniel's eyes locked on her, and for a brief moment, time slowed. The wind danced gently, the violin swelled, and even the breeze seemed to pause in reverence. Then it happened. A soft rustle among the seated guests. Heads turned. Gasps, barely audible, rippled like waves. A woman was walking slowly down the far side of the aisle, not from the altar's entrance, but from among the chairs. No one had seen her arrive. She was dressed in a floor-length red gown, bold and unignorable. Hair swept into a sleek chignon. Lips painted like blood. No jewelry, no purse. Just presence. Samantha. She didn't speak. She didn't even smile. She simply walked, calm, composed, and unapologetically stunning, until she found an empty seat in the second row, far too close to the altar to be coincidence. Daniel's breath hitched. His eyes widened. He forgot where he was. Cassandra saw it. She saw everything, the change in his posture, the way his fingers twitched, the flicker of recognition, and something far worse, awe. The silence that followed was deafening. The violins faltered. The officiant froze. The entire garden, draped in white and gold, now pulsed red at its center. Cassandra's steps slowed, her grip on her bouquet tightening until the stems cracked slightly in her hand. Her veil, once gently trailing behind her, now felt like a shroud. She met Samantha's gaze just briefly, an expressionless stare, devoid of malice but brimming with something far more disruptive, intention. The kind of intention that doesn't require words to burn everything down. Cassandra reached Daniel's side, but the air between them felt different now. He tried to focus, on her eyes, on the vows he had rehearsed, but the weight of what just happened crushed every syllable. The officiant cleared his throat, uncertain, then proceeded with the welcome. But everyone, every single guest, was watching not the couple, but the woman in red. Cassandra could feel their eyes veering, their curiosity chewing at her confidence. Daniel hadn't spoken. He hadn't explained. And that, more than anything, cracked the remaining porcelain of her composure. As the officiant asked them to join hands, Cassandra hesitated. She didn't look at Daniel. She looked at Samantha. Still silent. Still unmoved. And in that chilling stillness, Cassandra saw what no words could convey. Samantha had never truly left. Her body might have exited Daniel's life years ago, but her shadow had stayed. And now, on what was supposed to be the most sacred moment of their lives, the past had arrived dressed to kill, and stolen the spotlight without saying a word. The sun had retreated behind thin clouds, casting the garden in a pale, almost haunted light, as the officiant cleared his throat once more and gestured for the couple to begin their vows. Daniel, visibly shaken, turned slightly toward Cassandra, his eyes pleading, searching for grounding, but she didn't meet his gaze. Her shoulders remained high, rigid beneath the lace of her gown, her eyes fixed on the invitation card she now held with trembling fingers, a placeholder for composure. "I, Daniel Elias Reeve," he began, voice thin, "take you, Cassandra Ellen Monroe, to be my," he faltered. Just for a second. But in a room full of onlookers, in the presence of her, it was loud enough. Samantha hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Her silence, her stillness, was deafening. Cassandra blinked slowly, the rhythm of the moment collapsing like a building without beams. "Stop," she whispered. It was soft, but Daniel heard it. Everyone did. The officiant looked confused, waiting for clarification. "I'm sorry," Cassandra said louder, turning to the guests now, smiling politely but hollowly. I need a moment." Her voice did not crack, but her hands did. They dropped the bouquet, and it hit the wooden platform with a sharp thud. She turned, lifted her gown, and walked away, not running, not sobbing, just walking, with the poise of someone reclaiming control, even if she had no idea what to do with it. Behind the estate, hidden from the gaze of 120 guests, Cassandra found a side corridor near the catering tent and leaned against the cold brick wall. Her breaths came in short bursts, but no tears followed. Amelia arrived first, heels clicking across gravel, her face etched with panic. "Cass, what happened?" Cassandra didn't respond immediately. She turned to Amelia, and the question came out like glass breaking. Why didn't he stop looking at her? Riley joined seconds later, dressed slightly torn from sprinting, her voice sharp and immediate. "Tell me you want this wedding canceled and I'll slash every tier of that cake myself." Cassandra almost laughed. Almost. But then Daniel appeared, breathless, eyes red, tie undone, and for the first time since they met, Cassandra felt like she didn't recognize him. "Cass, please," he said, "it was nothing." She showed up uninvited. "I was just surprised. That's all." "You looked at her," Cassandra said, voice calm but deadly. "Not like you were surprised. Like you remembered something worth remembering." Daniel stepped forward, but Amelia raised a hand. "Don't," she warned. Riley folded her arms. "What does she want, Daniel?" He shook his head. "I don't know. She hasn't spoken to me. I swear." Cassandra scoffed, shaking her head slowly. She didn't have to. Her silence screamed loud enough. The trio of women stood like a wall, and for the first time, Daniel didn't know how to step through. Eventually, the guests were escorted back to the cocktail reception under the guise of a brief delay. The garden was reset, music resumed, but the couple never returned. Cassandra remained secluded in the bridal lounge, surrounded by torn tulle, half-eaten chocolate, and the ghost of promises still stuck in her throat. She removed her veil slowly, as if peeling away an identity. Daniel waited outside the door for almost 30 minutes, then left. He knew. There was no vow worth speaking now. That evening, the wedding planner announced that the ceremony would be postponed to a later date, no reason given. Samantha had vanished before the announcement was made, her seat empty, her perfume lingering in the air like a final signature. No one saw her leave. No one needed to. Her impact had already been written in the story. Cassandra sat alone into the night, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror across the room, wondering if she'd ever truly been the bride, or if she had only been holding a place in someone else's unfinished love story. In a world where silence could shatter everything, words suddenly felt meaningless. And the vow that once echoed with hope now hung in the air, unfinished. Like them. The following morning was unnervingly quiet. The Cedar Row estate, once alive with florists, laughter, and champagne flutes, now felt like the aftermath of an unfinished performance. The aisle still stood, but the flowers were wilting. Chairs remained misaligned, as if the truth had swept through and knocked them askew. Cassandra woke in Amelia's guest room, the late morning sun filtering through sheer curtains, illuminating the crushed train of her wedding gown, which she had thrown across the floor like an unwanted memory. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her silence spoke in waves. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, texts from distant relatives asking what happened, well-meaning friends offering comfort, and Daniel. Daniel's name flooded her notifications like a persistent ghost. Let's talk. Please. I didn't expect her to come. I only love you. Cassandra read them all. Reply to none. Her honeymoon suitcase sat untouched at the corner of the room. The flight to Santorini was scheduled for noon. Instead, she opened the suitcase, pulled out a pair of flats, a plain t-shirt, and jeans, then zipped it closed again. I'm not going, she told Amelia, who had just stepped in with a steaming mug of tea. Amelia didn't ask where. She just sat beside her sister and whispered, "You don't have to explain." Meanwhile, Daniel was unraveling. He returned to their apartment alone, the silence of the space louder than applause. Cassandra's absence was everywhere, her jacket still hanging by the door, her favorite mug left unwashed, the framed blueprint of their dream home tilted on the wall. Marcus came by to check on him and found Daniel sitting on the floor of the living room surrounded by open photo albums. "She's not answering," Daniel muttered, eyes red. "She shouldn't," Marcus replied coldly, tossing him a bottle of water. "You let her walk down the aisle into a battlefield." Daniel dropped his head in his hands. "I didn't know Samantha would show up. I swear on my mother's grave." Marcus sat beside him, the air heavy with tension. "Maybe not. But you knew what she was capable of. And you let her stay in your drawer. That wasn't a stranger, man. That was unfinished business. And unfinished business has a way of showing up dressed in red." Daniel didn't argue. He couldn't. His truth had already detonated, and there was nothing left to defend. He began deleting Samantha's number. Then paused. A new message had arrived. "We should talk. Before it's too late." It was from her. No emojis. No pretense. Daniel stared at it, knowing he stood on the edge of something irreversible. Again. Back at Amelia's, Cassandra walked into the kitchen wearing her robe and found Riley organizing her wedding gifts into a pile marked returns. "You don't have to do that," Cassandra said softly. Riley shrugged. "I needed something to break besides plates." They both forced a laugh, but it died quickly. Riley turned, her expression shifting to something serious. "You gonna talk to him?" Cassandra sighed. "Eventually. But not today. Not until I remember who I am outside of all this." Later that night, Cassandra sat on Amelia's small balcony wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea and watching the city lights blink like dying stars. Her mind flashed to the moment Daniel saw Samantha, how his face had lit up not with guilt, but familiarity. She hadn't been competing with another woman. She had been competing with a version of Daniel that hadn't yet closed its door. And that realization broke her heart in a way no betrayal ever could. It wasn't just that Samantha had arrived. It was that Daniel had never made it clear she wasn't welcome. As the night deepened, Cassandra opened her laptop, pulled up the email from the Smithsonian, and hovered her fingers over the keyboard. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She hit reply. Then typed 6 words, I'm available to begin next month. Send. Long before Cassandra, long before Portland, and long before he ever learned what real honesty cost, Daniel Reeve met Samantha Hale in a gallery much like the one where he would one day lose everything. It was in Manhattan, during his internship at a high-end architectural firm known for building glassy towers that pierced the clouds. He had gone to the exhibition begrudgingly, forced by his supervisor, but the moment he saw Samantha, dressed in a black silk jumpsuit with a silver thread collar and boots too sharp for comfort, something in him faltered. She wasn't just magnetic, she was impossible to ignore. She stood in front of a brutalist concrete sculpture and said aloud to no one, "It looks like ambition frozen mid-failure." He chuckled. She turned. And that was the beginning. Their love story was electric, combustible. She challenged him. He fascinated her. Nights were filled with rooftop wine, whispered vulnerabilities, and wild, feverish ideas about the future. But it wasn't long before the first cracks appeared. Samantha's hunger for recognition was unrelenting. She lived for stages, for spotlights, for adoration. Daniel admired her, but he also feared how her ambition would consume them both. Their relationship became a labyrinth of passion and performance. When Samantha got her first major show in Paris, she didn't invite Daniel, she announced it in passing like an afterthought. He followed anyway. He stood in the back, clapping, invisible. She told interviewers she was fiercely independent, even as she climbed into bed beside him every night. And then came the deal, the one that broke them. A developer known for controversial luxury towers offered Daniel a permanent position and funding for his dream design, in exchange for greenlighting a gentrification-heavy project Samantha had invested in. She was ecstatic. "This is how the game works," she had said, eyes gleaming. But Daniel couldn't say yes. The community the project would erase, immigrant families, artists, elders, reminded him of his mother's neighborhood, where warmth once meant more than gold. He turned the offer down. Samantha never forgave him. Their final fight was cataclysmic, screaming, shattered plates, and an email she leaked to a journalist, framing him as unreliable and idealistic to the point of sabotage. The industry turned cold. Doors closed. And Daniel, broken in ways he couldn't yet name, left New York with nothing but a duffel bag, a sketchbook, and shame that clung to his shadow. He never spoke of her again, until now. But what haunted Daniel wasn't just how it ended, it was the truth he had buried about how deeply she had wounded him. Samantha had a power over him that terrified him even years later. The way she could say nothing and still command a room. The way she wore silence like armor and elegance like a weapon. And he feared, more than anything, that Cassandra saw that too. He sat alone now, in his dim apartment, watching the rain streak down the windows like judgment. He remembered things he thought he'd forgotten, the night Samantha told him, "You'll always love the version of me that needed you," and the look in her eyes when she said it, not bitter, not cruel, just right. He hated that she was right. She knew he needed to be needed. And with Cassandra, he'd finally been chosen not out of hunger, but out of trust. Yet now he had fumbled that trust. His phone buzzed on the table again. Another message from Samantha, one conversation. "That's all I want." He stared at it, unsure whether the ache in his chest was guilt, longing, or fear. But somewhere inside him, a voice whispered what he couldn't silence anymore, "If you don't face the past, you'll bleed it into the future." And Daniel finally understood that ghosts don't rest until they're invited in or banished completely. Either way, they demand attention. Amelia had always been the anchor, level-headed, nurturing, and fiercely protective of Cassandra since the day they were brought together under one roof as stepsisters. Though not related by blood, their bond had always run deeper than shared DNA. Cassandra had once said that Amelia was her first real home after years of bouncing between her mother's perfectionism and her father's emotional absence. Which was why, on a Thursday afternoon, when Amelia hesitated, really hesitated, before answering Cassandra's question, the world tilted just slightly. They were sitting in Amelia's kitchen, scones cooling on the counter, untouched. Cassandra had been talking, or rather venting, about how she still couldn't piece together the exact reason for Samantha's silent invasion at the wedding. "It's like she didn't need to say a word to ruin everything," Cassandra murmured. I need to understand why she did it. What does she want?" Amelia's silence in that moment wasn't comforting. It was pointed. Cassandra looked up, immediately aware of the shift. "What?" she asked, voice tight. Amelia swallowed. Her fingers curled around the tea mug too tightly. And then came the fracture. "Cass, there's something I never told you." The word spilled like ink on white linen. Months before Cassandra even met Daniel, back when Amelia had still been in New York during a temporary gallery fellowship, she had met Samantha Hale. Not in a gallery or exhibit, but in a lounge bar where creatives mingled after events, seeking connection and inspiration. Samantha had approached her first, charming, magnetic, confident. They'd shared drinks, long conversations about femininity and design, the politics of gallery spaces, and slowly, flirtation had evolved into something physical. It wasn't love, Amelia made that clear, but it was intense. Brief. Complicated. She was like quicksand, Amelia confessed. You don't realize you're sinking until you've lost the ground beneath you. The relationship lasted a few weeks. Then Samantha ghosted her. No warning. Just disappeared. Amelia had chalked it up to another New York lesson until the day she saw Daniel's ex's name scribbled on an RSVP draft for the wedding. And her stomach dropped. But she hadn't said anything. Not when Daniel confirmed Samantha's identity. Not when she walked into that wedding in red. "I was afraid," Amelia said, eyes damp. "Afraid you'd think I hid it to protect her. Or that it meant something. But it didn't. I swear, Cass, it didn't." Cassandra just sat there, stunned. Betrayal was becoming a language she never asked to be fluent in. Before Cassandra could process Amelia's confession, Riley stormed in through the back entrance, breathless and holding her phone. "You're not going to believe this," she said, unlocking the screen and handing it over. There, in a forwarded email thread from a mutual PR contact, was a document, part of Samantha's press packet for her new luxury fashion brand launch. On page 2, listed among special guests and collaborators, was Daniel's name. Bold. Black. Official. Cassandra read it twice. "He said he had no contact with her," she whispered. Riley nodded grimly. "Looks like someone's lying." Again. Cassandra stood slowly, her fingers trembling. Or she's dragging his name into this to finish what she started. Amelia, guilt still heavy in her throat, stepped forward. "Cass, maybe we need to talk to her directly." Riley scoffed. "You want to give that woman a microphone after what she's done?" But Cassandra wasn't hearing them anymore. Her mind was spiraling. Between Daniel's hidden engagement, Samantha's silent destruction, and now Amelia's past connection, the ground beneath her was no longer just unstable, it was non-existent. "Everyone keeps telling me they had no idea she'd come back," she said, her voice flat. "But somehow, she was always here. Underneath everything. Hiding in everyone." And in that moment, Cassandra realized that before she could move forward, she needed one more thing, not space, not time. Answers. Real ones. And she was no longer waiting for them to come to her. The envelope arrived in a courier's hand wrapped in navy blue ribbon, addressed directly to Cassandra, with the return name embossed in gold, Harriet Ellen, her biological mother. Cassandra nearly dropped it when she saw the name. She hadn't heard from Harriet in over 10 years, not since she turned 18 and legally chose to remain with her stepfather and Amelia instead of joining the polished, distant woman who had walked away from motherhood to pursue international diplomacy. It had taken years for Cassandra to stop expecting birthday cards that never came, to erase Harriet's perfume from old blouses, to accept that being given life didn't mean being chosen. And yet, the letter was clear, official, and final. Her mother had passed away after a sudden cerebral aneurysm in Italy, and in her will, left behind everything to Cassandra, a fully paid historical building in Denver once used as an antique library, now in partial renovation. A trust fund with enough capital to launch or sustain a small institution, and a handwritten note that simply read, "I never stopped watching. This was always yours. Forgive me, if not as your mother, then as a woman who made too many choices too late." Cassandra sat on the floor of Amelia's living room staring at the papers, numb. The woman who had been absent for decades had now handed her a future, just as everyone else in her life was unraveling. Cassandra didn't tell anyone for 3 days. Not Amelia. Not Riley. Not even Daniel, who had sent one final message that read only, "I understand now. And I won't chase you anymore. I'm sorry for everything." She needed silence to think. Needed absence to breathe. Then, with startling clarity, she made a decision. She would leave Portland. The city that had once represented her rise now felt like a museum of ghosts. She would take the inheritance, move to Denver, and rebuild the space, not just as a gallery, but as a sanctuary for unspoken stories. The archive of the unfinished, she'd call it. A place where broken timelines could become beautiful again. Amelia supported the decision with teary pride, helping her pack while whispering, "This isn't the end, you know. It's your beginning." Riley threw her a farewell dinner with close friends, not once mentioning Daniel or Samantha, as if naming them would give them power. As the train pulled out of Union Station, Cassandra didn't cry. She watched the horizon shift, the skyline dissolve, and whispered to herself, "Now we see who I am without the shadow of anyone else." The seat beside her was empty. And for once, she wanted it that way. In Denver, the historic building stood regal but weary, sun-bleached stone, cracked archways, and iron-framed windows that still caught the morning light like stained glass. Cassandra walked through each room in silence, hearing the whispers of its former life. She saw herself in it, worn but standing. Her days became a rhythm of renewal. She oversaw the restoration personally, hand-picking artisans, digging into archives, and sketching the gallery's new layout on napkins late into the night. And slowly, the past faded, not forgotten, but no longer steering. The public didn't know her story. They only saw a poised, brilliant curator revitalizing an old Denver landmark into something bold and brave. Behind closed doors, however, healing was still a jagged journey. Cassandra would pause mid-brushstroke and wonder if Daniel was truly gone from her heart. Or if Amelia would ever fully trust herself again. But then she'd open a letter from a local artist thanking her for creating space for women's lost narratives, or she'd watch the paint dry on the walls of her new life and feel something real rise in her chest, peace, not because everything was fixed, but because she had chosen herself. And for Cassandra Monroe, who had once been defined by love, silence, and sacrifice, that was the most radical form of independence. Daniel had stopped checking Cassandra's social media weeks ago, telling himself that silence was nobler than obsession. But silence has a way of amplifying the things you try hardest not to hear. One afternoon, while walking out of a coffee shop near the Pearl District, he ran into Elena, the nurse and old friend who had once listened to his dreams without judgment. She looked different, older, wiser, but her eyes still saw through him. They talked casually at first, but as they sat outside under fading sunlight, Elena's voice softened. "I saw Samantha," she said. The name alone caused Daniel's pulse to stutter. "She came to the clinic. She didn't recognize me at first. She wasn't there for fashion. She was there for post-op care." Daniel blinked. "Post-op?" Elena hesitated. "Vocal cord paralysis. She had a tumor removed from her neck months ago. It was cancerous. She can't speak. Not anymore. That's why she was silent at the wedding. Not because she wanted to be cruel, Daniel. Because she literally couldn't speak." The world tilted. He felt like the ground beneath him had evaporated. He had spent weeks loathing her silence, assigning motive to every tilt of her head, every glance, when in truth, Samantha had been fighting a battle that neither he nor Cassandra had ever imagined. The revelation broke something open in him, not love, not longing, but a complex grief laced with guilt. He hadn't replied to Samantha's last message, believing it a trap. Now, with this new knowledge, he realized that her silence at the wedding wasn't an act of sabotage, it was a goodbye. That evening, Daniel sat in his dim apartment staring at the words on his phone for hours before finally responding, "Tell me where to meet you." He didn't know what he expected from the encounter, but when Samantha opened the door to her downtown loft, she looked like a shadow of the woman he once knew. Thinner. Paler. Yet still regal, still composed. Her voice was gone, but her presence wasn't. She typed on her phone and turned the screen toward him. "I didn't come to destroy your wedding. I came to forgive myself before I couldn't anymore." Daniel read it 3 times. His chest tightened. He had so many questions, so much pain, but now wasn't the time. He simply sat beside her on the couch and whispered the only truth left between them, "I don't hate you. But I can't fix what we broke. She nodded. A single tear slid down her cheek, and in the silence that followed, they made peace, not with words, but with what had gone unsaid for too long. The next morning, Daniel sat in his studio, surrounded by crumpled sketches and rolled blueprints, thinking of Cassandra. She had never known the full truth. She deserved to. Not for closure, not for reconciliation, but because honesty was the only thing he hadn't offered her when it mattered most. He opened his laptop and began typing, not a love letter, not an apology, but a full, unvarnished account. He told her about Samantha's illness, her silence, her regret. He told her what he had feared to admit, that part of him had never forgiven himself for what New York took from him, and part of him had leaned on Cassandra not just for love, but for redemption. You were never a replacement, he wrote. You were the beginning. You were the one who taught me how to be soft without being swallowed. You taught me that the past is only poison if we let it seep into the present. I'm sorry I didn't understand that soon enough. He attached the message to a quiet email with no subject line and hit send. Not expecting a response. Not even hoping. Just releasing what needed to be freed. He closed the laptop, took a breath, and stepped outside into the cold Portland air. For the first time in months, the silence around him felt like peace, not punishment. And whatever came next, Daniel finally understood. He could no longer live inside unfinished conversations. The gallery was silent in the moments before the doors opened, hushed, reverent, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of what they were about to witness. The archive of the unfinished, Cassandra's debut solo exhibit, was not just a collection, it was a manifesto. Curated from voices long silenced, from stories erased or left incomplete, each piece held a pulse. Oil portraits of widows who never remarried, sculptures of half-finished dances frozen in bronze, audio loops of unsent letters recited in fragmented whispers. The centerpiece installation stood alone in a sunlit room framed by cathedral windows, a suspended veil of cracked glass and lace, beneath which sat a simple velvet chair and an open journal that read, in delicate gold ink, to the words we never said. Cassandra stood behind a curtain in the back room, watching guests slowly trickle in. Her heart pounded, not with anxiety, but something deeper, presence. For the first time in months, she wasn't running from anything. She had turned her grief into gallery walls and built herself a space where truth, no matter how fractured, had a home. Amelia stood beside her, quiet and proud, while Riley buzzed through the lobby managing press photographers with her usual chaotic charm. And then, in the crowd, unannounced, reserved, she saw him. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't wave. He merely stood near the far entrance, hands clasped in front of him, eyes scanning the room not for her, but for her work. Cassandra observed him from behind the curtain, something inside her both still and unsettled. He wore no suit, no tie, just a dark turtleneck beneath a worn coat, his expression unreadable. She didn't expect him to come. But in some strange way, she wasn't surprised. He moved through the exhibit slowly, pausing longer than others, his fingers twitching with phantom sketches as he studied each detail. When he reached the centerpiece, he stood there for a long time. He bent slightly, read the open journal, and didn't move. Cassandra stepped out quietly, unseen by the guests, watching him from a distance. In that moment, no bitterness rose in her. Just memory. Gratitude. And release. As if the gallery had become a confessional, and her art the language through which all unfinished truths could finally exhale. She didn't approach him. She didn't need to. Some conversations could only be finished in silence. At the far edge of the final room was an exhibit Daniel hadn't expected. A velvet pedestal with a glass case, inside of which sat a letter, sealed, yellowed, and surrounded by petals of pressed lilies. It was labeled, her final words. It was Samantha's. Donated posthumously by her estate, the letter had been discovered in a safe deposit box 2 weeks after her death. She had passed just days before Cassandra's exhibition opened. With permission from her attorney, Cassandra had been given full rights to use it however she saw fit. Inside the case was a printed transcript, and as Daniel leaned in to read, his breath caught, "To the woman he loved next, I didn't come to take him back. I came to forgive myself, and to say goodbye without stealing more than I already had. If silence could scream, mine would have begged your forgiveness. If love can exist in fragments, then know he gave me one piece and saved the rest for you. Don't carry my ghost." Let it go. Daniel stood frozen. His shoulders trembled. Cassandra, now standing just behind him, whispered, "I read it the day before the opening. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was competing with a ghost." He turned slowly. Their eyes met. No tears. No declarations. Just two people who had survived something unspoken. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "Thank you for showing me who you are." She smiled gently, and with a final glance, walked away, toward the guests, the applause, the life she'd built from broken pieces now shining under gallery lights. Behind her, Daniel stood still in the echo of closure, an echo he would carry quietly, forever. The snow came late in Denver that year, dusting the gallery rooftop like a whispered benediction. Cassandra stood by the arched window in her upstairs studio, watching the city breathe beneath a silver sky. Her exhibit had completed its first rotation, earning praise from national critics, but it wasn't the applause that filled her, it was the quiet that followed. The kind that wasn't hollow, but earned. Healing hadn't been linear. Some nights, she still woke mid-dream reaching for something that wasn't there. But most mornings, she rose with steady hands and new purpose. She had begun teaching workshops at the local arts college, mentoring women who had almost given up on their voices. One of them, a young painter named Jolene, told her, "You're the reason I started again." That sentence meant more than a 5-star review ever could. In the evenings, she sat with Amelia on the balcony, watching dusk spill over the city, their silences no longer burdened by secrets, but held by sisterhood. Riley, ever dramatic, still sent chaotic voicemails about her dating life and the latest gallery drama back in Portland. They were all okay now. Different, but okay. And that was enough. In the corner of her studio sat a new canvas, a white one. Untouched. Waiting. Cassandra smiled at it. No ghosts this time. Just possibility. She hadn't expected the email from Daniel, not after the gallery night and their quiet farewell. It arrived 2 weeks later, with no subject line, just a single sentence, "I wish you healing too." That was it. And yet, it was everything. She read it 3 times, her thumb hovering over the reply icon. Then she simply smiled and closed her laptop. She didn't need to respond. Not with words. She had already answered in the way she lived now, with openness, with courage, with full breaths that no longer carried echoes. Somewhere across the world, she imagined him standing in front of a blank page, sketching something new. Maybe for someone else. Maybe just for himself. That thought no longer stung. It brought peace. Later that week, as part of her next exhibit's opening sequence, she installed a new piece, a suspended glass sculpture called The Final Thread, 2 threads woven from melted mirror shards, twisted together, never quite touching. Viewers stood silently before it, moved in ways they couldn't explain. And Cassandra, standing behind them, understood, closure wasn't silence. It was release. And she had finally let go. Thousands of miles away, in Florence, Daniel stood on the rooftop of a small design atelier nestled between moss-covered buildings and ancient cathedrals. The wind carried the scent of stone, espresso, and lavender. In his sketchbook, underlined in ink, were the words, Museo del Silenzio, a concept he had begun that morning. A museum built not to display art, but to preserve unspoken moments. He would design it to feel like breath, spaced light, curved halls, rooms that invited reflection more than conversation. At the edge of one concept sketch was a soft curve that resembled the lines of Cassandra's profile. He smiled faintly. Not from longing, but respect. Behind him, a woman named Alessia approached, an artist who had helped him translate the museum's mission into Italian. "Is this your first public design since Portland?" she asked. "No," he replied. "It's my first one that finally feels like mine." As the sun lowered over Tuscany, Daniel closed his sketchbook and looked out across the city, a soft sense of arrival humming in his chest. Not a destination. A new beginning. And somewhere, under a Denver snowfall, Cassandra dipped her brush into paint, ready to begin a canvas that carried no memory, no regret, just color. Just hope. The end.